Okay, today we're going to be uh, working with Jairus and his daughter, and this will be taken out of Matthew 9, and Mark 5, and Luke 8. So I'm just going to pause here. Yeah, Matthew 9, Luke 5, Luke or Mark 5, and Luke chapter 8 is where we're going to be going with Jairus and his daughter today. So now we're not going to be considering too much the story that is in the middle of this particular story, because there's the whole situation with the woman with the flow of blood, and that is a story really unto itself. Now we'll mention it a little bit today because it does have bearing on what happens with Jairus and his daughter, but we want to look just at him and that whole situation just as its own story, because there's an awful lot to take in. So we're going to be looking first of all at the passage in Matthew. So we have up on the screen there just this section, and this will come across as somewhat different than the other stories of Jairus, because we'll get. I'll make that known when we get to it. So verse 18 out of chapter 9 says, "While he spoke these things to them, behold, a ruler came and worshipped him, saying, 'My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live.' So Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. And suddenly a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she said to herself, 'If only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well.' But Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, 'Be of good cheer, daughter, your faith has made you well.' And the woman was made well from that hour. And when Jesus came into the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing, he said to them, 'Make room, for the girl is not dead but sleeping.' And they ridiculed him. But when the crowd was put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went out into all that land." Now, the thing that we need to sort of highlight in this particular rendering of the story is that Jairus, now his name is not here in this passage, but it is in the other passages in Mark and Luke. But it says in verse 18 that "my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live." The other stories very much indicate that the daughter is not dead at this particular point. And so Jesus then goes in order to cure her. But here it's saying that the daughter's already dead, and that comes across as a major contradiction. And but what we have to understand again about Matthew is offering a summary of these stories. That's why a lot of the stories in Matthew tend to be quite short, and they, it's like with the centurion's servant and all those kinds of things. There was differences there, but really, when you pull back and you understand who Matthew is writing to, and who then Mark and Luke are writing to, there is no contradiction, because what Matthew is doing is he's summarizing the situation, because Matthew doesn't talk about the people coming back from his house to tell Jairus that his daughter had died, and don't bother Jesus anymore with it. Those details are not in Matthew. So basically, Matthew knows about these details, but he's squeezing everything together and basically summarizing and using a quote to do that. But it's a summary saying, okay, well, basically through all this, the daughter did die, and that is the truth. He's just kind of hastening those facts along. And then he, in verse 23 there, it says, "Then when he came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players, noisy crowd wailing, and so on and so forth. So, but let's look at the other stories just to get the things together. So now this is just putting up pieces as we go. It says, now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, my little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Now it's at this point that the woman with the flow of blood then comes, and so what we're going to do is we're going to then jump to the end of that story and pick up where the whole thing with Jairus comes into play, because there was too much to put on the screen, because there's 10 verses there that we would have had to look at. So verse 35, it says, while he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, who said, your daughter is dead, why trouble the teacher any further? As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult, and those who wept and wailed loudly. And when he came in, he said to them, why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him, and entered where the child was lying. And then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. And then let's just look at the one out of Luke as well. And again, we're going to, just between verse 42 and 49, we're going to skip the thing with the woman touching him in the crowd, because we'll deal with that next week. So Luke 8, verse 40, it says, and so it was when Jesus returned that the multitude welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And behold, there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue, and he fell down at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter of 12 years of age, and she was dying. But as he went, the multitudes thronged him. And then we skip down to verse 49. And while he was still speaking, someone came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying to him, your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher. But when Jesus heard it, he answered him, saying, do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be made well. And when they came into the house, he permitted no one to go in except Peter, James, and John, and the father and mother of the girl. Now all wept and mourned for her, but he said, do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed him, knowing that she was dead. But he put them all outside and took her by the hand and called, saying, little girl, arise. Then her spirit returned, and she arose immediately, and he commanded that she be given something to eat. And her parents were astonished, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. So that's all the different stories from the Gospels, and obviously the one from Matthew is more of a summary and quite a bit shorter. And then Mark and Luke offer quite a lot more detail in terms of how Jairus approached Jesus, and we'll be looking at that in terms of some of the emotions that he was grappling with, and then and we'll look at Jesus and how he really demonstrated again authority over these situations, and how he pastorally dealt with this. So it's a wonderful, wonderful story. There's so much vivid detail in them. Wonderful emotion. There's desperation. There's hope. There's crying. There's joy. There's compassion. There's all kinds of things going on, and it is a very, very lively sort of thing. And when you dig deep into it and find out what some of these things mean, it does really cause your heart to rise. So we'll look here at the characters of the Bible initially, or this particular story. And of course, our first one is Jesus. And I'm going to be really referring mostly to Mark, the Gospel of Mark, because that's where the majority of the detail is for this particular story. And it talks there in verse 21, now when Jesus had crossed again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him. So, and when you look at the other Gospels, in regard to this whole situation, the three stories that tend to be kind of clumped together across the board with this is that Jesus is crossing over the Sea of Galilee, and we have the storm, and this is where the disciples says, Jesus, do you not care that we're perishing? And but Jesus stills the storm and gets to the other side, and then they have the demoniac of Gadara there, and Jesus deals with him, and then after that is going back across the water, and that's what happens in verse 21. So they sail 7 miles from Gadara back over to the other side on the shores near Capernaum, which was where Peter would have had his house, and that's where they their fishing village and all that stuff, and that would have been Jesus' kind of adopted headquarters. And that's where they have arrived. And it was during that transitional time across the sea that I believe that the disciples then reflected quite a lot about their own response to Jesus coming across, and realizing that Jesus had authority over the elements, and had authority in his word, and had authority over spiritual principalities and powers. And that was manifested as well with the demoniac of Gadara, and how he was sitting and clothed in his right mind after the Lord Jesus touched him. And so the disciples really realized, Jesus absolutely needs to be in the middle of everything that we're doing. So when they get across to the other side, the third situation, as it is sort of clumped together with these particular stories, is this whole situation with Jairus and his daughter, and also with the woman with the flow of blood. So and Jesus needs to be in the middle of these things. So Jesus is obviously the first and primary character here. And then we have the crowd, because it talks again there in the book of Mark, when they got out of the boat, that a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And and this is where he would have been teaching, and there would have been other things taking place. The called Matthew would have been lumped in there probably, as we see in some of the other Gospels. And so there's quite a lot of things that were happening in those day or couple of days that were taking place up there. So the crowds were always following Jesus. They're always about. They're quite a fickle bunch. They tend to be sort of fair weather believers, because they things are going well, praise the Lord. If things aren't going well, then Jesus is a bad person, So and they tend to sort of wax and wane. And then you have Jairus, and Jairus is a man, as it says in the Bible, who's a ruler of the synagogue, and so he was a prominent Jewish man. He would have been the individual that would have organized the Jewish gatherings in the synagogue. Now, the synagogue was an outgrowth of the Jews being in captivity in Babylon many centuries before that, because they didn't have Jerusalem in terms of the uh, in terms of being able to go and worship in a central place like the temple and that kind of thing. So that, the temple was destroyed under Nebuchadnezzar, and so the Jews then developed a system, and I believe it was a system of God, under God, that they then gathered in local sort of groups, and those were called synagogues. And so it's kind of a Jewish name for a church. Okay, so now it's not the same thing, but it is a gathering. So if there's a synagogue in Belfast, and that's where the Jews would gather to worship and that kind of thing. So all around the world there are synagogues, and those are things that have continued from really captivity times. So when the Jews came back from captivity, that whole sort of system was continued on. So and those would have been run by local elders and people that had qualification in these things. I would say Jairus was not a teacher necessarily. He wasn't a scribe. He wasn't a Pharisee. He wasn't a Sadducee. I don't believe that he belonged to those particular groupings of people, but he certainly would have had respect for them, and those men certainly would have had influence within the synagogue in terms of teaching and that kind of thing. But Jairus was a man who organized the meeting and made sure that there was people lined up to do different things. There was different sorts of men that were involved in the provision of practical elements and practical planning for the meeting, and also for pastoral care and things of that nature. So Jairus was a very, very involved individual, and so for him to actually come up to Jesus and solicit his help was sort of stepping out there a little bit, and with a potential of a bit of ridicule and so on, but we'll look at that in a minute. So, and then there's the little daughter, because Jairus is then coming up to Jesus and speaking to him about the only daughter that he has, the only child that he has, and she's 12 years of age. People try to figure out, well, what's the 12 mean? Why is 12 mentioned? Obviously, it's important because the age is there. It is interesting. You have the daughter who's 12 years old, and then you have the woman with the issue of blood who had that problem for 12 years. So what's in that? Not sure. You could probably dig something up. But anyway, I think sometimes with certain details in the Bible, you could get a bit carried away trying to figure out some sort of spiritual application or spiritual source, and it may be just the detail that here is a little daughter, and really was at the age of 12 is when little boys and little girls then became young men and young women. And so this was probably a very, very important age for Jairus and Mrs. Jairus, because their daughter was then starting to enter into that more adult sort of stage, and she's been some disease or something has come into her life and cut her out of her prime, as it were. And then we have the disciples, and the disciples are mentioned generally, but then there are the specific named disciples of Peter, James, and John. And in the book of Mark, this is the first time that those particular individuals are singled out as like an inner grouping within the 12. So because you see Peter, James, and John then frequently named together. And they're doing things with Jesus apart from the other disciples. So Jesus took these particular men, and I think invested a bit more time with them in terms of showing them the ropes, as it were, when they would then take the gospel forward and exercising leadership. So, so there's the disciples. And then there's the woman with the issue of blood. Now, the only reason we'll talk about her is because from Jairus's perspective, this woman's getting in the road. So she's in the way. She's a problem. She has a problem, but she's a problem to Jairus because Jairus is looking to Jesus to take him quickly down to his house so that his daughter can be healed. And she's sort of getting in the road, and for 10 verses within the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is dealing with her, and Jairus is probably standing there going, "Jesus, would you just hurry it up, please? This is getting a bit tight." So, so the woman with the issue of blood is obviously there in that story, but we'll look at her more specifically next time. And then we have the mourners that are mentioned. There's quite a lot of characters in this story. Some of the characters in some of these other stories just was Jesus and the individual he was dealing with. So there wasn't too many. But when the daughter died, burial usually took place fairly quickly because that is something that needed to be done. Middle Eastern funerals usually took place within 24 hours, and even to this day, they would bury people within a day. So unlike over in England, where you spend about a week and a half futzing around until you can get the funeral, it's desperate. But you had these mourners were not necessarily friends of the family. These would have been professional mourners. These were people that you actually paid to come to your house or lie in the street and weep and wail and carry on and make a lot of noise, and made it just a really dramatic sort of situation. So, so the mourners, these particular people are paid people. They're professional mourners. That's their job. I can't imagine really having being employed with such a company that says, "All right, today we have 3 funerals to do. So you people go down there and you cry and you weep and you wail and you be upset." And these people wouldn't have known Jairus or known Mrs. Jairus or known your girl from a hole in the wall, but that's what they did. And then you have Jairus and Mrs. Jairus. I just call her Mrs. Jairus. So they're there with Jesus in the house when Jesus performs the miracle. So there's quite a lot of characters in this particular story. And again, I think it's important just to make these little lists because then you can sort of single them out, and that there's individuals, that there's groups, you know then that there's the likes of the crowd, there's belief, there's excitement, there's pushing, there's shoving, and then there's ridicule, as we see later on in the story. So they're quite a fickle bunch, So, right. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at Jairus and his approach, and normally at this particular stage we would be talking about the authority that Jesus is demonstrating here. But what I figured was it's such a rich story that we'll sort of pepper it with some comments about Jesus' authority as we go through, especially Jesus and his pastoral response to this. But let's just look at Jairus and look at how he approached Jesus. And first of all, he wasn't really too worried about his reputation, because it says that one of the rulers of the synagogue came. This is verse 22 in chapter 5 of Mark. And Jairus by name, and when he saw him, you remember when we were talking about the things about what Jesus saw, there's probably another kind of interesting study to do, and that's what happened when people saw Jesus. But anyway, that's for another time. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, "So there's there's actually, four things that that Jairus is doing, and this all feeds into not being really worried about his own reputation, because we have to understand that this man had great responsibility in the local synagogue, and so he really was putting his own neck on the line by um, soliciting help from Jesus, who would have been regarded, especially by religious notoriety, as being problematic, being somewhat of a rebel, and fraternizing with the commoners, So, but what he does is he sees him, and I'm sure Jairus was excited when he saw Jesus, and because he knew that he had a problem in his life, problem in his family, and so he was able then to, when he sees Christ, he goes, "Here's an opportunity," and to pot with what everybody else thinks, I'm going to do something. So he sees him, and then he falls at his feet, and what that and in the other gospels it would say that he worshipped him, and so, and that word worship just very generally means to fall down prostrate at a person's, or at somebody's feet, or God's feet. So so from a visual point of view, it is just being on his face, and that would demonstrate that that Jairus really has an understanding that Jesus does have authority, and that Jesus, at the very least, has God in him. So now, whether his belief at this particular stage, did believe that Jesus was the Christ, I don't know, but there certainly is the understanding that God was certainly with Jesus. So so he falls at his feet and then begs him earnestly, and so he gets, he's on his face, and he then begs, and that's a position of really saying, Jesus, I am at my wit's end here. I've tried things. I've worried, and then when I saw you, I says there's hope there. I'm coming to you because I have no other place to go to. And really, that's where Jesus wants us to be. Jesus wants us to be in a place where we're going to look to him, and he's the only one that we can look to, because there's no other place to go. And so then he says, my little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed and she will live. And and he uses these very, very tender words of my little daughter. This is very personal to him when he says my, and then when he talks about little, it's the daughter is vulnerable. The daughter is small and petite and fragile, but it's his. It's his daughter, and it is his flesh and blood talking about his daughter. He's not talking about somebody outside of his family or something like this. This is his own family, and so he is really, really getting on his hands and knees here. So but what he has, Jairus, is he has great expectations, because as he makes this statement to Jesus, and sometimes that's what we need to do. We need to get on our face, as it were, and say, Jesus, this is what's going on in my life and in my family's life. She's at the point of death, but you come, lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. That's great expectations. So that is looking to Jesus and saying, Lord, you can do these things. You have authority to do these things, and I don't expect anything less. So so that's what he does. And it's interesting that Jairus's name means the Lord enlightens. And you know me and names and stuff like this. And I think Jairus's name is a wonderful name because it really does demonstrate, I think, really the inner workings of this individual. He wasn't a ruler of the synagogue by accident. He was a man that maybe got there because of his own reputation and of a man who was devoted, a man who loved the Lord, wanted to serve God, and but as his name would indicate, that God had put a light in him and showed him things. And so when he saw Jesus, there was, it's like a window opens up, and so there's light that comes in, and I'm sure he's just excited in his own soul that, Lord, now something can be done. There's a way forward. It's not darkness any longer. But then there's anxiety because it says there in verse 24, so Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Now, as Jesus is going with him, that's good. But then there's the crowd, and they follow him and start pushing around him. And so I'm sure Jairus was like, the last thing he needed was a crowd pushing and sort of delaying Jesus in this sense. And then for the next 10 verses, it talks about, and now a certain woman. Okay, so, and then there's this whole see-ho with this woman with the flow of blood for 12 years and, yada, 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 all these things that take place with her. I'm sure Jairus is just going, why does this have to happen? Why now? I've got my hands on Jesus, and Jesus is, he's coming to my house, and now he's getting delayed. And I'm sure Jairus was standing there going, Jesus, would you get on with it? Can you not, go and tell your woman to go and take a long walk off a short pier or something, or tell her to come back tomorrow, or come back later. I have things that need to be dealt with now. My daughter is important. My little daughter is important. And so I think during those next 10 verses, I'm sure Jairus was anxious, and I'm sure that he was just looking around him and probably rolling his eyes and just biting his lower lip and chewing his nails and all these kinds of things that we would associate with anxiety, and we would just go, what, come on, what is going on? I don't need this. This is the last thing I should get. So we have those 10 verses worth of your woman. So and then what happens there in verse 35, after all this stuff with the woman with the issue of blood, it says, while he, that's meaning Jesus, was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Now, I don't know about you, but the last words you want to hear in this situation is these 4 words, your daughter is dead. And I'm sure that Jairus, in his excitement and great expectation, and the Lord enlightening him and all these kinds of things and laying his reputation on the line and all this, and then there's anxiety, and then he's not pleased. He is angry. He is upset, and especially with this message that comes back from the house of these 4 words, your daughter is dead. And there is a great ring of permanence, as I would say, that I think would come upon you when you hear those words. and I'm sure my father wouldn't mind me sharing this. It's an emotional sort of thing for both of us. But I remember when my mother died on the 9th of August, 1981, and I remember standing out on my driveway at 5:30 in the morning, and there was a great sense of permanence that came over me. That I'm that this is the end of my mother's life. My mother's dead, and and there's no way forward with it. And so and it tends to really stop you in your tracks. It really does cause you in that particular point of time to be uh, quite upset and quite angry, and that's part of the stages of grief. When we do have one that passes away, you go through stages of shock and through numbness and through anger and blame and all these kinds of things, and then you come out the other side of it at some point where you then accept what's going on, and then you're able to move on. But I think for Jairus, this was hard stuff. This was difficult information to take on board, and so the messengers from Jairus's house, they say, "Why trouble the teacher any farther?" And I looked up. I have a Hebrew New Testament, and I looked up the word that was used in Hebrew there for teacher in this particular situation, because the language that would have been used amongst people back then would have been Aramaic or Hebrew, and Aramaic would have been a language that would have been very similar to Hebrew. It was something that sort of came out of captivity days in Babylon. But they wouldn't have necessarily spoke Greek to each other, even though the New Testament would have been written in Greek in terms of local people talking to each other who were all Jewish. They would have been speaking to each other either in Hebrew or Aramaic, and they're similar languages. But so there was three different words that were used that could be translated teacher or master. And there's the Hebrew word Rab, R-A-B. That's just how it is pronounced. But anyway, that means a pretty sort of standard issue teacher. Then there is a rabbi, okay, and we hear a lot about rabbis, and rabbis are more educated, sort of higher up the ladder, sort of teachers and masters of their craft, as it were. And then there is a rabboni, which is the top, and Jesus was often referred to as Rabboni, which would have been master, someone who was really at the top of the teaching ladder, as it were. But the word that was used here, at least in the Hebrew New Testament, as I can sort of gather from it, as I can read a little bit of Hebrew, is they say, "Why trouble the teacher any further?" And the word that they use here is Rab, and basically it's a bit of a shot across the bow here with Jesus, because they're basically saying, "Don't see the mediocre teacher, don't be bothering him anymore," And so they're using the term Rab. They didn't say rabbi, they didn't say Rabboni, they just said Rab. So. So just an interesting little side there. And because of this anger, I think Jairus was then very, very disappointed. Obviously, he was like, I had such great expectations that my daughter was going to be recovered and wouldn't die and all these sorts of things, and we'd all be happy. And Jesus got something stood in the way, and I'm sure he was disappointed with Jesus. I'm sure he was disappointed with the woman with the flow of blood. I'm sure he was disappointed with all sorts of things. And and I think there was a lot of hopelessness. I think that might, that's my next point there is really he lost hope. It's like, well, I've been told why trouble the teacher any further. There's no point. There's no point. So it really is a very, very, very down time. But then as you move through the story, in terms of what Jesus then does, he says, as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, brother James. And when he came, there was all the weeping and wail and so on. But he then, goes and heals the child, and so then there's great amazement. I think sometimes Jesus takes us down these roads where there is this real pit of despair. It's just like, I've trusted God with this stuff in my life, and now it's just completely pancaked, and I've lost it altogether. But Jesus then steps in and says, you know what? I can do things that are beyond you. I can do things that are beyond your expectations, and you'll be amazed. You'll be absolutely amazed. And that's how Jairus and his wife at this particular stage are very much glorifying God. So you can see, at the beginning of the list, Jairus sort of starts at the top of a hill, as it were, and then it's starting to go down to a big fat valley, and then it goes back up to another mountaintop. But really, it's in the valley. As my wife and I have been talking here of late, it's in the valley is where you grow. Because it's down the valley is where the lush plants grow. On top of the mountains, there's not much place for growth, in terms of, yes, there's great vistas and all that kind of stuff in life, and where you've gone and come from and where you're going and all this. But in terms of, the growth of things in your life, really, it's in the valleys of life where there is more growth. So now let's look at Jesus and his pastoral care, and this I find just incredibly exciting. Just give myself a drink, because when you look through the story, and again, just take it sort of verse by verse and word by word, Jesus is extraordinary. He's a wonderful pastor. He's the one that gets alongside of us in such wonderful and compassionate ways, and it's not just limited to this one story. He has gotten into our lives as well and has rescued us from the pits of despair. So, but Jesus is not flustered. One thing that's very important in pastoral care is not to get flustered. Now, it's easy to get flustered. It's easy to, basically throw the hands up and say, see these people, I can't be annoyed, So, despite the crowd, Jesus is not flustered or frustrated by anything. You don't get a sense of frustration. Now, just looking very briefly at the woman with the issue of blood, he knows that power goes out from him, and as she's touched the hem of his garment and so on, and we don't get any sense that Jesus is going, now who's touching me, for goodness sake, get a life, So it's not that. He actually then stops and takes time and deals with this thing. So he's not frustrated by this stuff. So very important aspect of pastoral care. And he's prepared to go, because when Jairus comes to him and falls at his feet and begs him earnestly and states his case about the daughter, it says, so Jesus went with him, and Jesus will come with us too. When we go to Jesus and say, Lord, this is what's going on in my life, and this is the the emotions that I have about these things and where it's taken me, and it's desperately frustrating and so on and so forth. Jesus is prepared to go to that, and he will go, and that's what it says. He went with him. So even those little words that you think are not a particular big deal, it is very important, to realize Jesus went with them. And Jesus goes to a lot of different places, and some people are surprised, when I'm, go and see people, I'll go to drive, a long number of miles, maybe a couple of hours or something like that, just to go and see one person. But Jesus came from heaven, and he came to you, and to save you, to minister to you, to help you, to encourage you. And he was not deterred by delays either. So if you're just looking back at our whole situation with the woman with the issue of blood, that was a quote delay, and yet Jesus is not deterred by this. He's not looking at this delay going, oh dear, here we go. This was not part of my plan. So if you don't, as they say, bend with the wind will knock you down. So sometimes Jesus had to sort of sway with the circumstances and deal with things as things came, but it didn't upset his main mission. Because Jesus knows all about this stuff. He knows knew that the woman was going to be coming with that whole scenario. But that didn't preclude Jesus and cause Jesus to go, oh, well, sorry about that. We got that a bit messed up. Sorry that your daughter's dead, but, sure, life's life and these things happen. But, Jesus is not deterred by that. He goes, right, okay, these things happen, but there's, because I'm in charge, because I have authority, things will happen the way I prescribe them to happen. And so then what he does is he offers words of power that bring hope. Now, if we look down at verse 35 and 36 here, it says, while he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house and said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any farther? And verse 36, as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. So Jesus is doing two things here as he hears this word, and I think that's very interesting, that because Jesus is very, very tuned in to what we hear, because what Jairus heard was very, very hard information, very dense sort of information. So what he then does in terms of responding to this, because he knows that this is kind of a two-pronged thing. So he says to the ruler of the synagogue, because words have power, he says, do not be afraid. What was in Jairus's mind and in his heart was fear, because he fear is a thing that results from the lack of control. Probably in some ways, Jairus felt that he was in control of what was going on, in the sense that, okay, I've got Jesus now. Jesus is coming with me. Okay, we've had this delay and we're getting going. We're good, great, super. And but then when these words of your daughter's dead comes, don't bother the teacher anymore. Those are words that just bring just sheer terror. Where does this go? Where do I emotionally go with this? What is this going to mean to my family? Everything about placing stock and inheritance, or any of these kinds of things. The family going forward is just dropped to the floor. So but Jesus brings these words of power, and he's saying, look, do not be afraid. That's fear does not come from me. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind, as it says in Timothy. So, and then what he does is he flips that coin and says, only believe. So, uh, so because he's then harnessing the whole aspect of faith in himself. So, because if you live in the world of fear, fear will preclude you from that. So, you have to take away something and then replace it with something that's far better. So he takes the fear and says, look, believe, put your faith in me. And now that's hard when you're looking at it going, I don't know how this is going to work, and sometimes that's where God has us. We don't know how it's going to work. We don't have a prescription. We don't have an agenda. We don't have a plan. That's where we need to trust Jesus in these things. So, and what Jesus does as a pastor here is that he sees far beyond the circumstances. So he, as he says, do not be afraid, only believe. He does then make this statement. He says later on, says, when he came in and he said to them, why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. Now, I've actually read some commentators that would actually suggest that actually Jesus was saying she, was literally sleeping. She was actually only in a coma or something like that. But for professional mourners to be hired and all these sorts of things, there was, cause to do this, and that was because she was dead. So she, was beyond the pale and beyond human ability there, and so Jesus was talking metaphorically and figuratively and saying, look, she's not dead but sleeping, because he was seeing beyond what man could see, and praise God that Jesus does that with us. He said he sees far, far, far beyond what our own local time-oriented circumstances sort of dictate. So, but Jesus, in the face of this, faces derision and scorn, because it says here, and after he says, the child is not dead but sleeping, it says in verse 40, and they ridiculed him, and that sort of word is used throughout the Gospels. There, they ridiculed him, as I was looking up the word ridicule this morning, it really has to do with really being in somebody's face and laughing at them, and just saying, what, are you nuts? Are you off your head, or what is wrong with you? And you don't live in reality. Jesus lives in far more reality than most of us. But as Jesus, as the pastor here, he faces an awful lot of this stuff. He faces this scorn, he faces derision, he faces ridicule, and people laughing at him and so on. But despite that, he gets on with it. So, and I think it's interesting that in the in Matthew there, he uses this term, or uses this phrase, make room. The child is not sleeping, or the child is not dead but sleeping. And sometimes what we need to do is we need to make room, and we need to, give Jesus that space to come and do what he needs to do. So now, it's interesting here that what he does is he puts everybody out, because it says there, and they ridiculed him, but when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him, and handed where the child was lying. So Jesus, in a lot of ways, cannot operate unless there's belief present. And so, because when he was in Nazareth, and this was one of the reasons that Jesus marveled. It says that he marveled at their unbelief, and it actually says in the scriptures that he didn't do many miracles in Nazareth because of their unbelief, and so not much happened there because of unbelief. And yet, where there is belief, there's things that happen. So Jesus is pleased with belief, but but when we're crowded in by a lot of people sort of muscling in and says, don't bother the teacher anymore. See him, see what he said. He's nuts. He's crazy. And we get fed with all this negativity that tells us to believe otherwise. Jesus is saying, what we need to do? We need to put that out. We need to put it outside the house. We need to put it outside of your sphere of influence and that kind of thing, and say, look, we need to deal with this and deal with it in a presence of belief and a presence of faith. So and then it says that on the screen there, it says he acted and he spoke very tenderly and commandingly. And this part of the story is just very, very exciting. It says as they entered in with mom and dad and Peter, James, and John, it says there in verse 41, and he took the child by the hand. And, you can see Jesus very gently sitting on the edge of, if it was a mat, that she was lying on the floor, or it might have been a little short bed, or some raised thing, or something like this. I would imagine their home, they probably would have been, maybe middle class sort of people. So they may have had a few bits of furniture that were a bit more upmarket than, say, just a maybe working class or something like that. But it doesn't matter. He went into this situation and he says, he took the child by the hand. So I could just see him. She was on the floor, getting on his knees, and then maybe just kind of riding, kind of rolling over onto his bottom, as it were, and then sort of leaning over and then taking her by the hand and being very, very tender with the girl, and just very much taking on board all of the desperate emotions, and but Jesus knew where he was going with this, and so there was an excitement in his soul, and but I think in Jesus' mind, nothing else mattered at this point. The only thing that mattered was to engage with this girl and to do things that were beyond human capability, and so in a kind of an eternal sort of perspective, this is one of these places where eternity, I think, paused, because Jesus took her by the hand. He stopped, and he took this piece of time and brought it to a standstill and engaged with it. So but he says here, he took her by the hand, and then he says to her, and this is peculiar of Mark here, where he says, Talitha Kumi, and Mark does this sometimes, where he takes Aramaic statements, spoken by Jewish people. He is writing to Roman Christians, or and people that are somewhat outside of perhaps understanding some of the particular cultural nuances, and so he explains these things, and so he uses this language, Talitha Kuma, which is Aramaic, and says, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. Now, sometimes when we read the scriptures, we would look at that and say, so what's the big deal? Or we just read through it and say, that's nice. Jesus dealt with this girl in a nice way. But Talitha and Kumi, when you look at the language, and you look at the meanings of those words, and you look at the how those words are said, because the problem with reading something is, and especially the likes of English, when you read English, unless there's adverbs in there, which are descriptive terms describing verbs, meaning action words, it sort of tells you what the action is like. you kind of go, well, what's the emotion behind this? What's going on? But within Aramaic and Hebrew, a lot of that stuff was embedded in the word itself. So Talitha was a term that actually meant quite literally little lamb. So little vulnerable lamb. A little lamb that was born just days before, something like that, just getting on their feet, unsteady, meh, meh, and just knows nothing other than its mother and a bit of grass that's around them. So Jesus is looking at this little girl and is treating her with such tenderness and such individuality, and saying she's a little lamb. She's fragile. She's somebody that I need to take her by the hand, and I need to hold her very, very carefully. And so he speaks to her in that sense and says she's just a little lamb. And so that was paired up with the idea of a little, as it says there, little girl. But it's much more than just a little girl. It's this little tender lamb that is fragile. And but he says it very, very softly. He says, little lamb. So he's speaking very, very quietly. But then he says this word kumi, which is a word that's in an emphatic tense and an imperative tense, which means get up, get up. He's really starting to talk to her quite loudly, and infusing in her resurrection power, and and this is the kind of thing that he would have been saying to Lazarus in chapter 11 of John. Lazarus, come forth. And so it was authoritative. It was commanding. And so he starts off saying very quietly, little lamb, get up. And so to me this is just a really, really exciting sort of thing that Jesus is doing here. And that's again how he would speak into our lives. He's not just going to stand far off at the door and say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get yourself going. He comes alongside of us and he speaks tenderly to us, and then he then commands. He puts things into us, and which is the kind of energy and the kind of supernatural resurrection power that we need. And it says in Ephesians chapter 1, that says that we might know the exceeding greatness of his power toward us who believe, even that same power that raised Christ from the dead and seated him at the right hand of power. And so what Jesus wants us to know from him is resurrection power and resurrection statements. We're not supposed to be mamby-pamby here. This is real get up and go sort of stuff. So when Jesus then speaks resurrection power words, then verse 42 makes a lot of sense. It says, immediately the girl arose. Well, that's what happens when God speaks into your life. So and she walked, for she was 12 years of age. And but what Jesus does with this, and we're just there's two more things here, and we'll just come to a close because we're coming up to half one. But he instructs them practically, and he says, but he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given to her to eat. So so Jesus is not interested just purely in spiritual things, as it were. He is interested in holistic care, and the girl needed something to eat. And so that's part of holistic care. And sometimes I with the guy there recently, and we were talking about his physicality and how he was feeling about certain things, and I was like, well, maybe you should consider eating something like this. It might make you feel a bit better in regard to the complaint that you're talking about. And it's just practical stuff. Because sometimes when you're eating junk, you feel rotten. So and you think, oh, that's all right, but sometimes, God wants us to look pragmatically at our own, how we treat our body and that kind of thing. So Jesus is looking at this. But the other thing that is a bit strange is when he says he commanded them strictly that no one should know it. Now it's like, how do you do that? Here's a girl that just got raised from the dead. You have a bunch of professional mourners out the back or out the front, and they're going boogaloo, and you want these people to say nothing, you know. But that's not really what it's about. I think that what's going on here is that Jesus is not interested in his own personal fanfare, in terms of, okay, here we are, I'm the miracle worker, and this is what we do. But he's more interested really in the, as I put here, maintaining the personal moment. And it's, talking about really Jesus wants this to be a thing that's just for Jairus and Mrs. Jairus and the daughter. This is your thing. This is your time. The emphasis is on you, not anything else. And it's about Jesus' interaction with them personally. So, but Jesus wasn't interested in being known as just a curiosity or a miracle worker or something like that. He was far more interested in getting into people's personal lives that made then eternal difference. So I think in a lot of ways, I think Jesus just wanted to get out the back door and head out, so instead of being, mommed again, and oh, look at that, wow, So because again, Jesus didn't want that kind of notoriety. It was more about, what can Jesus do in your life on a very, very deep level, as opposed to just a curiosity or a publicity thing. So, but Jesus in his pastoral care, there's an awful lot of teaching, an awful lot of stuff in here that is very, very useful and very, very good. So that's Jairus and his daughter, and next week we'll be looking at the woman with the issue of blood and just a lot of the things that are going on in that particular situation. So